Welcome to the Financial Planners Southeast Asia podcast, a show dedicated to driving the positive evolution of financial advice, specifically within Southeast Asia. To join a global community of financial advisors sharing and learning with one another to drive the positive evolution of financial advice, head to xyadvisor.com. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Financial Planners Southeast Asia podcast. Gwen here, and today I am with another financial advisor. He is Joel Kerin, and he's a senior financial advisor for Australians and Australian Expats at Ally Wealth Management. Thank you so much for being on the show, Joel.
Thanks, Gwen. It's a privilege to be on the show with you.
No, the pleasure is all mine. As I mentioned before we started the podcast, that when I spoke to Jared, whom was the previous episode that I recorded, I realized that there were a lot of things that I didn't know about expat advice. Before Jared, I only knew one person who was a financial advisor who had a lot of expat clients. So I was very keen to know more about how financial advisors, such as yourself, work closely with expats. But before that, I'd like to let our listeners get to know you more. So first, Joel, how did you get into financial advice?
I suppose it all probably started way back. I was working in, I suppose, a little bit of I wouldn't call it mediocre, but just a plain average admin style role when I was living in Sydney. And then, one day I was talking to my dad, and one of Dad's very good friends is a financial advisor. And so I suppose the conversation just sort of channeled in on that, and I didn't really think much of it for 6 to 12 months later. And then I was driving home from work once in Sydney, and I just saw for example, a billboard which was I think it was for TAFE, New South Wales, or something like this, and it was study something or start the year fresh or something like that.
Yeah.
And it just I suppose made me think about, I was like, oh well, what am I doing realistically? So I think it might be definitely worthwhile to get back into some study and just really see where that goes. So I went and I basically signed up to a financial advice. I think it was an advanced diploma of financial advice or something like that. And I was like, do you know what? This is actually really interesting, the fundamentals of advice. So, and this is obviously all post 2013. So that would have been post FOFA. So it was all sort of modern financial advice and what really they wanted the industry to go into. And I think I'd sort of understood from a little onset how it is transitioning, and I don't know, it just got me really quite interested. And then I was just so lucky that from then onwards I applied for a job. I was working for ANZ, and I just slotted into a I suppose a financial advice sort of support role, and from there it just sort of flourished. I ended up having to, go into then, boutique mum and dad firms. I've done life insurance, so I've worked for a very large life insurance, I suppose, advice business, and then now expat advice. So it's just sort of been this forever developing affair, really. But it's just been such a good industry, right? And it just, I suppose, it really disappointed me. Some of the things on the back of the Royal Commission, they some things were brought up, and it's like, oh well, in a way, because all of my training and study has been post all of these, I suppose, systematic problems.
Yeah,
I feel like a lot of us, got hit with the same stick.
That's true.
yeah. So I was just like, oh, do you know what? This is something that I'm now passionate about, and I'm so prepared to, I suppose, carry on and yeah, and learn new things. And financial advice for expats is definitely a new niche.
Yes, yes, and as I mentioned, again, we started talking even before we hit record. Like, I don't know a lot of people who, or a lot of financial advisors who took to servicing expats,
Mm,
especially exclusively, and hearing from the passion in your voice, really passionate about helping a lot of people. And I just find your story interesting in a way that your story is like most financial advisor stories. So
mm,
there was one financial advisor who I spoke to said nobody when they were young ever said that they wanted to be a financial advisor, right?
yeah.
Most of us wanted to be doctors or artists, engineers, lawyers, what have you, but nobody really knew anyone who said they wanted to be a financial advisor. But most financial advisors, if not all, has become financial advisors because of a certain calling and because of the appeal of the financial advice that seems like it's such a good way to help people,
Mm,
um, and it's such a good advocacy as well to help them because money isn't only financial, it's also an emotional part of a
mm,
human being. And it's
absolutely.
more yeah, because all of our decisions sometimes in life, or especially in the start of our lives, or in the start of our 20s, revolve around money, and it affects us mentally. So being able to help people with how they can get better at money so that they can also get better in life is such a great achievement. Now, and especially for expats, because I've been reading up a bit on expat advice, and it turns out, well, it's actually no surprise, but as an expat, their financial position is often more complex. And there are
Mm,
many things to consider, especially if you're like, where do you invest? Do you invest in the place that where you're working? Do you invest in your country, like in Australia? But
mm.
I guess, like, because of these complexities, how did you end up like wanting to give advice to expats in the first place?
Oh, I suppose it was definitely on the back of, something, I had this drive to continue to learn and
Mm,
understand things a little bit more. So I wanted something different. I wanted a new financial advice story or project per se. And I think over the past, 5 to 6 years, particularly in financial advice, what I've really noticed is that in Australia particularly, a lot of education is missing from general people around financial literacy. So,
mm,
and what happens is, if that base fundamental of financial literacy isn't there, then suddenly you go offshore to other jurisdictions. It does become much more complex because you need to consider obviously like tax treatments and investment options of different countries, as well as I suppose trying to ascertain and manage your financial life back in Australia.
that's true.
So,
True.
it's something that I think people, generally speaking, so the clients that I deal with here, they are so receptive of the advice because, this might be something that they're not quite sure on, or, they just constantly reach out because they want additional clarity on stuff. So and I suppose my job really, can be summed down to education, right? I like to educate all of my clients to, in a way, help them have a better sense of financial literacy and have
Yeah.
a better sense of the advice and where they're actually going from a goals perspective.
Yes, that's very. interesting that that's why you picked on expats as your main or ideal client. And that's so true, right? Like having to learn how the financial background works in one country is one thing, but having
Mm.
to like learn and like go back and forth on like two separate countries, especially like if the expat decided to live in an Asian country where our set of rules and government regulations are far different from what is there in Australia. So I guess when you started out as a financial planner and then you decided, like, did you decide that, hey, I want to work with expats? Did you decide on that, or did it just come organically for you?
No, no, it more or less came organically. Like it's, I knew that when before I started working for Ally, I wanted something a little bit more. I wanted a fresh challenge, something that I can that's really going to challenge me. And I suppose I learned very quickly since I joined Ally that I suppose a lot of my job initially was looking at where these clients existed and then studying up tax agreements or dual tax agreements between two countries. And so I was like, oh well, this can either be really exciting for some or it's
Mhm.
hell boring.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it just happened this way, just on this search for something different. Like I went to, I remember I was looking for something else, and then yeah, it just sort of happened,
Oh,
and
that's
I was like,
good.
this is perfect.
Hmm.
Mm,
That's wonderful, and it's wonderful that you picked up on that, right? So because I know that there
mm,
are things that happen in our lives that might have been something that we could have pursued, but we didn't pursue it. So for
mm,
you, you actually when it happened, kind of happened organically for you. You
mm.
decided that although it might be boring for some people, you just found it really interesting and went along with it. So
Mm.
now you specialize in is that a correct term? You specialize in
Probably,
expat
probably.
advice.
Probably, yeah. And
Yeah.
I also moved across the country. So I
Oh
moved
yeah, yeah.
from Sydney to Perth. So it
To
was like,
Perth, yeah,
yeah.
right. Oh, and
Um,
that's one of the interesting things that I have learned is that you are from Perth, but you service expats.
yeah.
So, and I know that you started this in like, so you've been doing this for like a year now, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
at the start of or during the pandemic, so did that move of sort of being an expert in expat advice started even while you were here in Australia? Did it start because of the rise of being able to do interviews and meetings in Zoom?
Uh, oh, look, I suppose that's a good question because I don't actually know, I suppose, what it would have looked like
Yeah,
pre-COVID.
yeah.
I can imagine in some respect it probably would have been a little bit harder, but Zoom has just brought us all that little bit closer. And this might sound, I suppose, a little bit odd to some people, but there is, a significant, I suppose, a very large majority of my client base I've never actually met face to face.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I've never shook their hand, but I've seen them obviously on Zoom every couple of months, and we have a good chat. But yeah, no, I've never actually, shaken their hand, had a coffee with them.
Yeah, so
It's Yeah, so I think generally technology now it's just probably made this whole expat advice particularly that little bit easier. And if
mm.
you look at, I suppose, the silver lining of COVID, that sort of really helped the process.
Oh, that's so true.
Mm,
Because as you mentioned before, it might have been very challenging for
mm,
financial advisors who would like to service expats, but they're not in the country that where the expat is currently located,
yeah,
right? So
that's right.
you
Yeah.
like have to be like Jared Brown, who is actually in that country, in Singapore or here in the Philippines or whatever. But now, because of the power of technology, because of Zoom, because we're forced in this situation by the pandemic, it has brought us a new kind of the way we serve clients. And
Mm.
I guess how do you, because you have never met your clients, like how do you provide value for them as a financial planner, especially in the initial parts of the relationship?
Yeah, and I suppose there's probably a lot more work that goes in the front end from our perspective. So there's probably a lot more time that I spend with the clients in developing strategy around developing objectives, and I suppose in a way setting some expectations, right? And how we sort of see it playing out. Well, I suppose because realistically, the clients that I'm servicing, right, they are Australians, but they're
Mm-mm,
just not in Australia. So
mm-mm,
based on what Jared was saying in his podcast, he was speaking about a very large majority of Australians come back to Australia.
yeah,
And in a
yeah,
way that is so true. Lots of clients that I deal with that are, all over the world, they still see Australia as home.
yeah.
And
So
they are still so receptive, to I don't know whether it's, me, but they're very receptive to just hearing a familiar voice, hearing another
mm.
Australian accent. And so it just
Yeah,
perhaps it's based on that, right? It's you demonstrate your value that way, that says, what, I don't really care where you live. I'm happy to support you and to help strategize with you to lead to these sort of, I suppose, your desired outcome.
right. That's and I guess that's true in a way. Like, I'm sure that however far Australians are, or other people from other countries, like if they're not in their homeland, they still tend to be homesick, and they
Mm,
try to look for familiar faces. And I know this for a fact because I know that the Filipinos around the world are have a tight knit community of fellow Filipinos as well. Um,
mm,
and I also know that like a friend of mine who is an expert at expat advice for Filipinos know how close this community is, and because there are like, let's say an Australian expat comes to you, and he and you give of course great advice to him, you have a good relationship. Does that automatically, or does that client automatically send out a lot of referrals to you? Is that
yeah, look,
how you've grown your
yeah.
business?
Yeah, it's in a way, a lot of this has happened via sort of osmosis, referrals, and generally people just looking for that sort of speciality, because they need to have someone that sort of understands the situation. Let's just say, right, if you had a client that was in the Philippines or Singapore, wherever, right, reaching out to a local financial planner there might result in them not being able to understand I suppose, the treatments of investments or any assets they've got in their home country.
Yeah.
So, yeah, like it's just really, and it's really rewarding. I will say that, to have, people that will openly come and say, what, this is so valuable, and thanks so much, Joel. Um,
Mm.
and even so much that, previously we've had clients that are offshore recommend their family and friends that actually just live here in Australia. So, not all of
Ah,
my clients are
expats.
expats.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are here.
Ah,
Um,
nice.
so it just sort of yeah happens organically, and it's quite refreshing as an advisor to have that.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think I read it in like um, an email like quote that I received from a financial advisor, that referral is the greatest form of flattery.
Mm,
So that's really nice that even the the clients that you have that are currently expats are also referring friends and family who are already based in, or are still in Australia. That
mm,
means that you have really gained their trust, and that you are doing a great job with
yeah.
how you deal with their finances, and that's why they're happy to refer you to family and friends. So, and I guess when you started out in financial advice, how are you able to acquire clients? Did you have to go through like um, all the marketing stuff, posting to social media, getting your name out
Mm.
there, or did you already have clients that you just brought across?
So when I first started financial advice, I remember, getting or gaining new clients was, I don't know, it just seemed so much harder than what it is now in, I suppose, in the expat sort of space. Originally when I started, it was just more or less as a review advisor per se of an existing book of clients, and occasionally, you would do, I suppose, bring on new clients, just add to that book, and then
Yeah.
it just sort of grows organically. But this one is actually, like, I suppose, the role that I'm in now, that it's very much more. Yeah, we get so much more inquiries. We get so many more referrals. It's just by means of, I suppose, complexity more than anything. Someone's got a query that needs solving. Someone's got an issue that needs fixing, and obviously you could get this email with a mind dump of 10, 20 questions. You go, okay, let me just spend an hour thinking about this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And but that's very interesting, in a way that, do you think that there is a relation to how it's much easier now to acquire new clients, especially as you mentioned, expats, because of the start of the pandemic?
Mm. I think, yeah, probably. I think in a way the pandemic really pushed people to think about their life.
Mm,
So, if I think about, even myself included, right? We all had, we all were essentially living a quite a normal, average, probably free, fun life, right?
yeah.
And then suddenly the pandemic happens. We're all being locked in our homes, for months on end.
Yeah.
And, and it just sort of highlighted to me as well, and probably to a lot of other people, was what would happen if all of my money just stopped, right? Because of this. And I think because of that rational thought, people are saying, well, I really should pay more attention to my finance. I should pay more attention to my wealth, because this is not something that is essentially guaranteed. And at some point we need to take some onus on ourselves and end the lifestyle that we like to live. And what do we do about that? So
Yeah.
I think the conversation around exploring finances is a lot more easier. Like, people are, I think, a little bit less reserved than where they were, say, 4 or 5 years ago. Like, to talk about money to someone, yeah, 5 to 7 years ago, even particularly, that was, some people were, I would say, a little bit more guarded.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree.
but today it's sort of just opened that up because they're like, well, we've seen or known someone that have had a really hard time in the pandemic. And I suppose we need to explore this. We need to hash it out.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. And although a lot of like unfortunate things have happened because of the pandemic, I really feel like it has brought up some good things as well. Like first, what we discussed about like being able to service clients via Zoom
Mm.
because the pandemic has forced us to use it as a way to communicate on a regular basis, and now it has also forced us to really get to know ourselves. And one of those things is our financial selves, and the possibilities, the future, and all that stuff, which is important. But again, what you mentioned, we didn't really talk about it before.
No.
So yeah, and so it's a good opportunity for financial advisors to get in this bandwagon, to start really thinking about if they want to help expats as well, because you are a really great testament to that, right? Like you service Australians who aren't in the same country as you,
Mm.
and yet you still communicate with them, you still provide great value, and you know this because they provide referrals to you. Now, but
Obviously, we don't want too many advisors to take up that because then
yes,
that
of
would that
course.
would eat into my pool.
Yes, that's true. But I guess and I feel like I brought you into the show because although you guys are already doing this in Australia, I just feel like there's not much here in Southeast Asia. Like I only know one person who caters to Filipino expats, but I know that I should know more. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
really few people who does this type of services, or really few financial advisors who um, does this kind of service. But it's important because, like, if we're not going to help our like fellow expats, or like a Filipino expat, who are they going to turn to? And as you mentioned
Mm.
earlier, like it's really easier to talk to someone from the same country as you, because you already know, or at least they already know, like the regulations of that country, and even like how and your mindsets, right? Like you have like this intrinsic, how
You
do
can
you,
you can just sort of relate. You can just sort of
yes, yes,
relate.
yes,
Your
yeah.
cultural knowledge is sort of relatively all the same.
Yeah, that's true.
Um,
Yeah, yeah, that's what I mean. Thank you. So,
mm.
um, but oh, and speaking about that as well, how often do you meet with your clients throughout the year? By the way, because you guys aren't from. I know that like before, pre-pandemic, like some of the clients that you have would just say, hey, I have this question, can I come over
Mm.
to your office, or can we get a cup of coffee, and then you meet and then you talk. But because first it's because of the pandemic, and second because your clients are literally um,
Yeah.
like uh, miles and miles and miles away. How often do you catch up with them, just
Yeah.
still to provide the best quality of advice?
Well, naturally as well, we sort of tailor everything to each client. Like obviously, we've got different types of clients. So
Yeah,
we've got some, you know, really really large executives, even just to, I suppose, regular people. And it's about sometimes some people are really time poor, some people are very engaged, and it's about meeting in that middle. But at least we want to, particularly at Ally, we want to maintain a consistent approach to all of our clients. So, we regularly do updates, every month or quarter to all of our client base, just to touch base with them, see how they're going, and they could get updated reports and stuff like that. And then we try and make it a little bit more interactive so we can bring in like webinars and stuff with our
Mm.
client base as well, just to make sure that they're getting, or they're, I suppose, touching on topics, or we can touch on topics that they may not necessarily be thinking about, but then it comes to light. Um,
Mm.
but no, it's like, I suppose, even probably in compared to all of my other roles that I've held as a financial advisor,
Yeah.
this one is probably the most engaging. This one is,
Mm.
from a client service perspective, it's very busy. Like, my calendar generally looks pretty full around client meetings. And that's really nice to have,
Yeah.
because when you've got a really engaged client, then they obviously appreciate all of the services and the advice and the information that they're getting.
Oh, that's true. That's so true. Especially what you said, that you offer webinars for your clients as well. And that's a great way for them to like realize, hey, that's true, I haven't thought about this, we should talk about it, I should talk about this with Joel. So I really feel like that's a really great way, and it adds value to your clients as well. Like, what do you do? It's just a 1 hour seminar, like a 30-minute
Yeah,
seminar.
that's
um,
it.
but it's going to stay with your clients for such a long time. They're really going to feel good about it because you've added a different kind of value to them. And I'm sure like, you don't include this in the package, right? Like, you don't say
No,
that this your services includes webinars and all that stuff. But when you offer this to them, like, hey, do you have time? Can you join us for a webinar like this? I feel like that's really going to help them not only with their finances, but how they would like to build a better relationship with you as a financial advisor.
that's right. Or it could be this. It could all come back on the back of, say, I have one particular client that had a particular issue,
Mm,
and it's sort of like, oh, well, now that we've gone down that road of trying to solve that, or fix it, right?
mm,
Do we have any of our other client base that might be in, if it's a country or domicile issue, or they're in a certain life stage, right? It could be just like, join us for this webinar where we're going to hash out X, right? And it could be 15, 20, 30 minutes, right? It doesn't have to be as long. And, it's just about me saying, well, this is what happened, right? For an example, and this is how we fixed it. So, like,
mm.
is this something that, you might feel that could impact you? Then if it does, reach out. We've obviously got the tools now to fix that. And that's obviously part of this, because particularly in expat advice, regulation and that changes all the time in Australia
Yes,
alone.
yes. Mm.
And then you've got to, I suppose, keep abreast of the changes that happen in other countries as well that could impact your clients.
Mm.
So, yeah, like, it's good, but yeah, it's just a bit like, you've got to be prepared to invest the time to keep up with that, I
Yeah.
guess. Mm,
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think that's one. It's like, I really want to ask that, but I feel like that topic needs another like full 31 hour minute podcast. Is how financial advisors who um, service expats like tackle having to learn different types of like, I know that you have to listen to the news and study regulations for this, and like the investment type for this particular country. So that's very interesting.
mm.
Unfortunately, we wouldn't have the time on this podcast, but hopefully we can discuss it in the future. But yes, that's very interesting. And I feel like for some people, and I think this is one of the things that you mentioned, that's part of, some people might find it boring, but how you guys, or financial advisors like you, are able to tackle that, um, those types of like servicing your clients that way.
I think when this, really comes back to having, clients that value financial advice and that you
Yes.
have good relationships with. Like, for example, if you were my client in the Philippines and something changed in there where they could have potentially said, I don't know, there's now going to be a new tax on Australian investments or something, right?
Mm-mm.
Now, obviously, naturally, an Australian will go, is that going to impact me? Like, even if they just saw it, right? You can guarantee it's going to be hot in my inbox
Mm. Yeah.
within a hot minute. So the clients themselves such a good feeder of that information, but of course there is so much other research that has to go in, and particularly when we're doing like reviews with our clients, we need to FASEA and all of the changes that have come in, particularly in Australia,
Mm-mm.
it really addresses. We've got to address the broader impacts of our advice. So it's just being ensured that at the time that I suppose you're going down this review path, that the advice that you're giving is still appropriate. That's
Yeah.
really what it comes down to. And yes, that can be time consuming. Yes, it can be painful with lots of reading. But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, it is. I find it rewarding because the client really appreciates that.
Yes, definitely. I would think so. Just the thought of having to read a bunch of different types of regulations. And I know that like your clients will really appreciate you for it because it's not an easy thing to tackle on. So I'd really like to pick your brain on that a little bit further, and unfortunately, we we won't have the time for this particular podcast. But hopefully, we can do it in the future. For now,
Yeah, sure.
though, yeah, that would be awesome. But for now, like, what would you give for an upcoming financial advisor who might be joining your team, who might want to service expats as well? What's the best advice that you can provide to them if they're still starting out?
If they're just starting out, I suppose my one, I suppose, bit of advice would be what you think is about to be turned on its head. It's very much more challenging, and I suppose that's probably why historically, existing financial advisors have turned away from giving expat advice. Just because it adds this whole extra layer of complexity, which they could essentially avoid. But at the end of the day, for someone that's just starting out, it's very rewarding. It's very engaging particularly with your client. And when done right, you've you potentially have made a client for life. So
Yes. Yeah.
that in itself is from a financial advisor perspective is very humbling.
Definitely. And
Yeah.
thank you so much for that advice, Joel, and for being in the show. But before we formally end it, where would people, if they want to get to know you more, if they want to chat with you, where can they reach you?
Oh, they can, reach me on the LinkedIn, send me an email, Ally Wealth's website, trust me, I'm
Ah,
not that hard. I'm not that hard to track down. Um,
wonderful.
and yeah, like, what I just, generally speaking, I just love speaking and meeting new people because, everyone comes from a different walk of life. You might have walked down the same street once, and it's
Yeah.
just every person that you meet, right? There is definitely a learning curve. There's definitely something new to learn.
Ah,
Um, and if
definitely.
you take that opportunity, then you're going to be better off for it.
That is like one of the best things that I've found in when I started the podcast is I get to meet people because I started this podcast last year during the pandemic as well.
Mm.
And I found that it's such a great comfort to hear other people's lives. It makes you feel like, oh, once this pandemic is over, I'm going to have coffee with this guy. So, right? So,
Yeah.
it just feels like the world is interesting, and that's why there are a lot of podcasts that are out there as well. I think is because there are really a lot of interesting stories like yours, like Jared's, and many others that are just waiting to be captured. So yes, thank you so much,
And I think,
Joel.
as I said, the pandemic's helped that because it's allowed us to express new mediums like
Ah, yes.
podcasts. No one
Mm.
heard what a podcast was before.
Yes, that's true. That's so true. That's so true. I think the podcast industry boomed because of the pandemic.
Oh, yeah.
And particularly podcasts that pertains to like having conversations such as like the ones that we're doing right now. People like to hear other people's stories, so I think it's very important that we share ours.
Yeah, of course.
Wonderful. So again, thank you so much for being in the show, Joel. It was so good speaking with you, and I hope that I can have you on the show again. But for now, have a wonderful day, or at least
Thanks, Gwen.
evening.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Gwen. We'll talk to you soon.
Yes, no problem. Bye bye.